You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens. Well, hello there, Sasha.
Hello there, Stella. So we have a couple of special familiar guests with us today. We'd like to introduce two of the members of the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association, Lisa Marchiano and Joe Burgo. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Nice to be here. So
we wanted to have you on today to kind of talk about a couple of important things. And we thought we could start out by just... We've talked a lot about GETA throughout our various episodes, Stella, and it's often in passing, but we really wanted to explain a little bit more about the organization, why we exist, who we are, and then share kind of an exciting announcement about an important launch that we are doing. So where do we want to start, guys?
Well, maybe I'll just say a little bit about why I thought GETA should exist. You know, the three of us were the original thinkers around it, and then we were very quickly joined by Roberto D'Angelo from Australia, who was a very important member of the team, and more recently, and very happily, Joe has also joined us. But I was getting so many emails from clinicians. I was getting contacted by so many clinicians who said, you know, I think there's something off about this affirmative approach. It doesn't really feel right to me, but I don't really know what to do about it. And I was also getting a lot of emails, as I know all of us do, from families who were looking for therapists who would engage in real therapy rather than simply kind of co-signing a young person's self-diagnosis. So it seemed that there needed to be a place for therapists to find each other, create new knowledge about how to work in this space, and to be able to offer their services to members of the public. And hence, GETA was born.
Right. That's how I found GETA, is because I was uncertain how to work with this population. I was looking for supervision. I'd heard about Sasha already, and Sasha recommended me to come into the group because there's nothing out there for people who are not working in the affirmative mode.
Yeah, I suppose I've had no more than yourselves, like so many therapists who are keen to work in it, but kind of afraid to. There's this kind of exceptionalism of gender, as if they're not allowed work with gender. And when somebody kind of is pushed away, kind of saying, you won't get this, you know, I think a lot of clinicians feel it would be arrogant of them to presume that they could. And so they go looking for, well, where could I get trained? Where could I find out about it? And there really isn't very many places. There's certainly a hell of a lot of workshops and training available for gender affirmative, but there isn't for any other sort of approach to understanding gender. So, you know, for example, exploratory, developmental approach, a trauma-informed approach. There's a lot of ways to understand gender. But I do think that there it really feels like there was, you know, one show in town for a few years and all the general therapists stayed away, and we kind of welcomed them, I think.
And if you have a feeling in your gut that affirmation might not be the whole answer, you can feel very alienated and isolated within professional circles because everyone else is going along with that train of thought. And if you say something on your listserv or your, you know, professional Facebook page or something, you often get attacked. So people are kind of washing up on our shores after having some rough experiences.
Plus, there's this feeling that gender is this exception to everything you know.
Yeah.
Everything you ever learned as a therapist, it doesn't apply to gender. So you feel very lost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think what really stands out for me is that all of the clinicians who are now really active within GETA and for our kind of leadership team, we really believe in a kind of back to basics approach, which addresses what you're bringing up, Joe, and something, Stella, you talk about a lot. And it's so important because when you have this emerging population with a new kind of presenting problem, it's very seductive to latch onto a new exotic kind of novel therapy approach. But really what we know from decades of watching kind of psychiatric, socially mediated phenomena come and go is that a back to basics approach that really honors the complexity of a person's psyche and how we are impacted by our environment, that seems to be a tried and true way of working with different types of patient groups. And I really like a line that we often repeat within the GETA membership statement and some of our online resources: psychological approach to psychological problems. And that's, I think, what really makes GETA stand out compared to some of the novel therapeutic approaches that are being used on a novel population.
We really like the shiny new toy in psychology, don't we? Every few years for 150 years, we've been coming up with, we've got a new one. And probably, there's some of them are very, very interesting, and it does make for very interesting study. And yet, honestly, if you just brought it back 150 years and said all along it was a psychological approach to psychological problems, that could have covered all the CBTs and solution bills. You know what I mean? There's an awful lot of different jargon is big in our field.
It sure is.
Isn't it? We suffer from it. We really suffer from it. And I think we all were very engaged by the fact that a lot of therapists in GETA and outside GETA who were contacting us really sought not only to join GETA, but they're seeking guidance. I think there's a lack of confidence among therapists. And I actually think any therapist could handle gender. There's a bit of a kind of, you have to learn the jargon, you have to learn a few concepts, you have to know about the online world. There's a few things you need to know. But really, if you're an experienced clinician, you should be able to handle it. But I feel that there's a very strong desire for a lot of therapists to say, give me an actual document, give me something that I can actually work from. And so we've decided to try and reach that, try and achieve that. Who wants to launch it to the world, our grand new plan?
Well, we've been working on this document now for, I think it's been a couple of years. So it's a group of international clinicians, highly trained, very skilled, lots of experience in this area. And we have developed a clinical guide for therapists working with gender questioning youth. And we've done it in conjunction with the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. So it's kind of been co-authored by SEGM and GETA. And it is a very usable but thorough document that kind of goes through what exploratory therapy is and isn't. It looks at the research, kind of an overview of what we know. It looks at other clinical guidance from other countries. And it just looks at basically at a psychotherapy approach to gender dysphoria. And finally, there are some really terrific case studies in there that will help clinicians see, oh yes, that's what they're doing. That's what I do when I see, people with other internal conflicts. So the case studies kind of cover a range of presentations, and I think it would be a really strong start for anyone just wanting to get up to speed with this. And we'll be launching it at a webinar in early December.
I think one of the most reassuring things the guidance does is both in the general chapters and in the case studies is it takes the concept of gender and shows how it puts it in a developmental relational context, and it shows people, oh yeah, this is just like what we normally do. I think it takes the fear factor out, is that I'm not
Yeah.
dealing with something absolutely exceptional. It's these are developmental issues, right?
Yeah, that's the key thing. When you actually can read it to yourself and look at the guidelines, look at the kind of the case study, look at where it's coming from. I feel it'll be a very reassuring document for people who think, I think I might be able to work in this field, but I kind of don't dare because I'm being told it's so exotic, nobody will ever understand it. And then they'll see guidelines and they'll see this and they'll go, okay, this is doable. I think I truly believe a lot of therapists will enter the field when they read it because they'll say, yeah, I can take this, I can handle this. And they should be. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of young people desperately needing therapists. The parents are tearing their hair out looking for therapists, and there aren't enough therapists who are willing to work in this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think being able to have that confidence kind of comes from a few places. I mean, on one hand, reading through the guidance, I think will create a parallel process to what we often hear from parents who we talk to when they say, you know, in my gut, I kind of had this sense that this would have been the right approach, but I had no outside validation that what I was thinking was true. And I think that happens a lot with therapists as well. Like, you know, if you've been working in the field for 10, 20, 30 years and you've worked with adolescents your whole career, you know instinctively that there is identity exploration, there's the individuation process going on. And so I think a lot of therapists will read this document and feel reassurance that their clinical instincts were indeed correct. And then also, you know, the organization GETA creates that reassurance because we are kind of a united front of therapists. Now, we all come from different backgrounds and everyone may have a different approach to how they work with gender, but being part of a unified group of clinicians who all kind of agree with our membership statement gives you the confidence to know that I'm not just this one person shouting into the ether. There are hundreds of other experienced, seasoned, knowledgeable clinicians who also can trust their clinical intuition on an issue that feels kind of scary sometimes.
You know, I want to just say something else too, that GETA itself and the clinical guide, we don't put forward a model for working with gender dysphoria. This is not some kind of novel approach that we've manualized and developed. We're really just saying, go back to basics, go back to your basic training about how to do therapy, and work within these, as Joe said, these developmental frameworks or these biopsychosocial frameworks that we're all used to working under. And that means that there's room for a range of different approaches. So you might work primarily psychodynamically. I think you'll see a lot in the guide that will be familiar. You might more work with cognitive behavioral techniques. And again, I think you'll see stuff in the guide that will be familiar. So it isn't a narrow formulation about how to do this. We're not purporting to put forward a new model of therapy. We're actually just saying, dust off your chops and go in there and do what you already know how to do.
Yeah, that's a key point, because I think I think, you know, this world of gender, and we speak about it a lot, and I don't think we quite often emphasize the point enough that the new kid in town is the gender affirmative approach. That came in like a rocket around about 10 years ago. It's very hard to put a date on it exactly, but it is definitely, it's the new approach. Well, we're actually traditional conventional psychotherapy, and it's basically these guidelines is just bringing together all the knowledge that has been accumulated over many years, and then we've kind of put gender into the context of our psychological understanding, and created the guidelines around that. So while the references are very much up to date and very much based on gender. The thinking is conventional psychotherapeutic thinking.
Mm-hmm. I think, there's so much to the guidance that we're really going to flush out in that webinar that you mentioned, Lisa. But I think it would be valuable now just to help our audience get a grasp of what this guidance is. We can talk a little bit about what it is and what it is not, because especially when there's such a huge controversy right now in the public amongst clinicians and physicians about how to support kids with gender dysphoria. There's a lot of worry about things like conversion therapy and what's exploratory therapy. So let's just kind of go through some of the main points to explain, what the guidance is and then what it isn't. So I guess I can start off by saying, we are trying to put forward an approach that would be open to a variety of outcomes, meaning we do not necessarily think that identifying with one's birth gender is the desired outcome, nor do we think that celebrating a trans identity is the only necessary outcome. So working from this approach means that the client has all of his or her options open, and that identity does not have to follow a particular path, and it is not seen like it's favorable to have one identity outcome versus another.
If I may, what I always like to analogize here is that a lot of times people come into therapy and they say, I'm thinking of leaving my marriage. And when someone says that to me, I'm not thinking, oh yeah, she needs to leave her marriage. Let me give her the number of a divorce lawyer. Nor am I thinking, oh my God, how terrible. She shouldn't leave her marriage. It's like I am gonna be agnostic and sit down and open that up with that person and let her have a full process without me putting, I'm going to try my hardest to avoid putting my finger on the scale.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Another thing that gender exploratory therapy does is it appreciates that gender dysphoria can emerge in a context. Right? So like all other kinds of distress, there's a developmental, a family, a relational, a social context. And so in helping the client with that thorough process, we want to give them lots of different lenses to understand the contextual way that their gender dysphoria emerged.
Yeah, I would say all distress arises in a context, and we seek to understand where the distress comes from and what meaning it has. This is just a very normal part of what we do in the consulting room.
Mm-hmm. There's also developmental kind of appreciation for this as well. So working especially with adolescents, as they are the largest cohort of people seeking out gender services now, we have to keep in mind that adolescents are going through a specific process which is typical of the adolescent experience. So the guidance also takes this into consideration.
Yeah, I would just add that understanding how we progress through these developmental stages is just, again, it's just so key to a young person's process. So taking a developmental approach, just very bread and butter stuff.
One of the very useful things in the guidelines is the way that especially in the case studies, the way that the therapists show how you can approach the issue of gender in a way that will help the adolescents to open their minds to other possibilities. It is one of the challenges of working with this cohort. It's not different from every other type of client you work with, but they do come in with a definite opinion about what the issue is, and they expect you to accept their views at face value. So I think there's some really good guidance about how to approach that and how to get these kids to open their minds to other possibilities.
Mm-hmm. To get curious about it.
Yeah, I remember GenSpec did a kind of a seminar for college counselors. And it went very well. It was very interesting, but I was really surprised, and it got backed up by a lot of people agreeing. When one counsellor said, working as a counsellor, it's all often very muddy, And there's often very not a clear-cut path, and we're all nodding along at this point. And she said, and yet when we had a client who had gender distress, it was like, oh, great, I know this. I have the solution. I know. And they'd slam them into the affirmative section. Off they'd go, I've got this. So it was a real source of relief. And the other counsellors in this college seminar were agreeing, saying, oh, yeah. And she kind of came up with the question saying, but it seems like they're just like everybody else. And I was like, yeah. No answers, muddy, complicated, we contain multitudes. And, that is the work of the therapist, to live in the ambivalence and to live in that place where there isn't a simple answer. And actually, if there is a simple answer, to be a little bit wary, because you might be simplifying the issue when it could be more complex than that. So it was really sad, but it gave me a glimpse into why people would jump on the affirmative approach. Because I think finally there's something with a clear-cut answer, a path and a solution. Lovely. At least one part of my job is easy.
Yeah, and especially given that there are a lot of comorbid conditions that tend to present along with gender dysphoria, the guide also talks a little bit about how important it is to work with those other experiences as well, without necessarily dismissing the importance that the identity is playing for the client. So I think being able to kind of walk that fine line is something that therapists can find really challenging. And then they might look at the guidance and say, oh yeah, actually I do know how to do this. I do know how to work with multiple presenting issues at the same time.
And there's really useful guidance about conducting a full assessment. That's really invaluable. And there's a lot of material on the actual statistics about suicide risk, because therapists can be really worried about what they've heard about suicide risk. And so there's reassurance that way about, here's what the numbers actually say.
Yeah, I thought the section on suicide was just so great. It's really very concise and thorough. And Joe, I want to pick up your point about assessment, because another thing that's explicit in the guide about exploratory therapy is to pay attention to the sexual development of the young person, and that this is a really important part of assessment, because as we know very well, some kids who are taking this route may be same-sex attracted and have some shame about that, and are electing to identify as trans because that is actually less shameful than admitting to themselves that they're gay or lesbian. So that has got to be an important part of the discussion. And I know, one of the dismaying things reading about what it was like at the Tavistock is that was you just didn't talk about that. So it's really, the affirmative approach has, I think, really been doing a huge disservice to lesbian and gay kids. And that's got to be part of our assessment. It's got to be part of what we explore.
Right.
I know WPATH obviously released their standards of care, and to a lot of controversy as far as I can see. And, they have been really the only show in town that have been offering anything for anybody with gender. It's kind of astonishing when you realize that there has not been other steers, really. There hasn't been other places to go. And I kind of think, isn't that amazing? Like, they're on standards of care 8. They've been kind of releasing effectively different guidance for quite some time, certainly since 1979. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm thrilled we're releasing this, and I look forward to other people with other groups, with other analysis, entering the world of gender and saying, how about this? You know what I mean? There's more than one way to look at these things. And I think it's extraordinary that there's only really been one show in town. It's stunning that there hasn't been other serious organizations saying, how about looking at it this way or whatever. But we're very much saying, well, let's take a psychotherapeutic look at this.
Well, for so long, it's been on every level, no discussion allowed about anything. And we're saying, well, wait, yeah, yes, there is discussion. And there's a lot of it. So,
Yeah, because therapists like to talk.
yeah.
And we like to listen. I mean, that's also mirrored in just our advocating of like extended periods of time, right? I mean, I think some of the shocking stories that I hear from young people or older people who transitioned is like, I had one conversation or I had 2-hour-long conversations, and our clinical guidance says, this is a long process, not because we are quote gatekeeping and we expect people to prove something to the therapist, but that individuals deserve a full opportunity to process and explore and understand themselves and the gender dysphoria in all of these kind of contextual ways. So it is also not you do this quick assessment, you rule out certain kinds of comorbid conditions, and then you send a person along their way. You give every individual like a fair shot at really deeply knowing themselves.
And I'm a Jungian analyst, so we don't really do brief treatment over here in my corner of the world. But so obviously, I guess I'm biased in this regard. But I'm thinking back to my analogy about the person who comes in who says, I think I want to leave my marriage, and this is a pretty common presentation in my practice. And the people that I've worked with, men and women through the years that have come in with that. And I would say that probably the average amount of time that we work together before they make a decision one way or another is probably 1.5 years of weekly treatment. And in that time, we, explore, how did you feel when the relationship started? How was your week with your spouse this week? And, what are your fantasies and what dreams did you have about it? And, hey, have you tried couples therapy as well? And we look at it from every possible angle. And then often the person gets to a point where they feel, what I always say is you don't feel, you're not looking for certainty, you're looking for clarity. Because if you're certain, that's probably a sign that you're defending against something. And we could talk about that too, because many of these kids are so certain. And I think that that's actually a bad sign, because it shows that you don't have a relationship with your ambivalence. But in any case, yes, I mean, a thorough process takes time.
Mm-hmm. We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for this show, and we're grateful to Rhyme and GenSpect for supporting us.
Rhyme, or Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And GenSpect is an international alliance of parents and professional groups whose aim is to advocate for parents of gender-questioning children and young people.
If you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts and special Q&As, and you can join our listener community.
Now back to the show.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I love that distinction between certainty and clarity. And I mean, this also makes me think a little bit about the informed consent process, which, as we know from, talking with people who have regret, they all report that they did not feel like they were fully given the informed consent opportunity. And that goes beyond a list of tick boxes of like, do you know that this might happen? Do you know that this might happen? Informed consent, when it's really thoroughly undertaken, is like, let's really sit with the possibility of, what if you change your mind? Let's really examine what that looks like. Let's sit with the social experience, the personal experience. What will it be like to live in a body that appears differently from how you identify? You know that feeling, right? So like, these are not just simply, did you know you might go bald? Did you know you might get acne? So we talk about that in the guidance as well, as like, what does a true informed consent process look like, and why it's important for therapists to be able to stay grounded in biological reality while still honoring, the role of the identity. And I think that's really important.
Well, and I think that's such a crucial chapter, and it's so well documented, and it's very authoritative, and it's important because as we all know, informed consent isn't really happening. It's cursory so I think that's a really strong and important chapter in the guidelines.
The thing about informed consent is it'll give you strength when you have dark nights of the soul. If you've been really delved into something, if you've really weighed it up, if you've looked at all the different signs and you still decide to go forth, and then some years later you think, this is harder than I thought it would be, and I'm coming to regret it. You the knowledge that you really grappled with it at the time will make you, it'll give you confidence. You'll think, I genuinely weighed it all up and I went for it. So it'll make it so much more palatable that you did something. Maybe it hasn't worked out, but it won't feel like I never explored it. There's something so frightening about that.
I agree completely, Stella, to look back and say, but I had a good process. I made the best decision I could have at the time. That is a very different experience than to tumble into this dark void of, God, I did something and I didn't even really think about it. And I was just, God help me, over on Twitter. And there's a detransitioner was posting about other detransitioners in detrans groups, saying that they thought their breasts would grow back once they stopped testosterone.
Yeah, I saw that.
And, I think that informed consent in this area is so important because young people are getting a lot of misinformation online. So a good therapeutic process would unearth some of these assumptions and make sure the person's progressing. I've worked with young people who really, really thought that taking testosterone was going to turn them into a man. And, that's, you're not setting yourself up for a good outcome if you don't have reality-based expectations about what this treatment's going to do and not do.
That's so crucial. That's so crucial. And that's why ideology and belief systems really do not have a place in therapy. On either side, no ideology really belongs in therapy because we really have to help clients understand a true, realistic version of what might happen if they took this path or that path.
And when there's comorbidities with autism and stuff, I remember speaking with a mother and child, and the discussion was, how testosterone might impact, and it was a kind of wide range of discussion. It wasn't really therapeutic. It was just we were chatting, and when I spoke about the ravages testosterone could do to the female body, the kid who was autistic, was on the spectrum, said, "Oh yeah, but the testosterone wouldn't wreck my body the way it would yours, Stella, because you see, I'm male." But that was the black and white thinking, which it gave me a better insight into the autistic mind than anything else. It was because I'm using the male pronouns and I've identified as male. Testosterone won't hit me the way it would hit you, Stella, because you're female. And I that took my breath away. I was like,
oh gosh,
this is a whole different way of understanding everything. And when you are working in that world, that's when you realize, oh my God, informed consent needs to take a whole step back to make sure that we've got everything explored to counteract a very literal understanding of any given situation.
I want us to talk for a few minutes about what exploratory therapy is not.
Okay.
And the first thing I want to say is it is not conversion therapy. And that's what we're routinely accused of. But gender exploratory therapy does not aim for any fixed outcome in regard to how one experiences or expresses gender. So that we're not, as we've said a couple different ways tonight, we're not looking for a certain outcome.
Yeah, and it might be worth just touching on how this conflation came up. I know we've covered this in the podcast before, but conversion therapy was a term originally used to describe attempts to make same-sex attract people straight. And there were a huge variety of interventions that therapists and psychologists and clergy members and counselors used to use, ranging from, physical torture all the way to kind of coercion and kind of black emotional manipulation and things like that. And luckily, this practice has been thoroughly discredited. I mean, no serious therapist is using any conversion therapy efforts on gay clients. But this has been lumped in with gender identity in such a way that you just stick the word gender identity into these conversion therapy bans and assume that it applies in the same way. But frankly, we have no research whatsoever on, let's say, a body affirming therapy or a therapy that helps a person explore why they feel such a disconnect with their sexed body. That is very different from therapies which attempt to make people change their sexual attractions, which are quite rooted in the body. So we just want to kind of make that distinction, because I think, like the therapists we talked about earlier, who might be a bit nervous to work with this population, often feel that way because they don't want to be accused of practicing conversion therapy. And we have articulated very clearly in this guidance that this is absolutely a completely unfounded type of claim that is made against anyone who questions the affirmative care model. And we have no doubt whatsoever that anyone who reads this guidance will come away with the same conclusion.
And, and hand in hand with that, there's also a pretty thorough accounting of the evidence base for affirmative therapy. What it shows, what it doesn't show in terms of its effectiveness, that's covered as well.
Is there anything else exploratory therapy is not? It's not WPATH.
Well, and another thing that we say that I really like is it does not assume that a trans identification is universally adaptive. It might be adaptive, but it might not be. It might be a response to trauma or developmental difficulties, and it might be a good enough response, and it might not be. And there's room to question that, as there always should be. We all have ways that we deal with our distress, and some of those ways are adaptive and move us forward in life and help us grow and thrive and flourish, and some of them don't.
Yeah.
And if you're engaged in a maladaptive behavior, your therapist ought to be able to help you explore that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, our guidance touches on processes that may not be in our active conscious awareness. And, that terminology, I think, can feel alienating for some contemporary clinicians who maybe weren't trained or familiar with that kind of language. But I mean, we also call it like implicit thinking or, maladaptive coping. And I think there are a lot of different ways to frame that. But our guidance takes into consideration that we have our surface story, and then there's what's going on beneath the surface. And I think the whole point of therapy is that we often need the help of a third person or a third party to give us that opportunity to explore what else could be going on. Because if we could do it ourselves, we wouldn't need the support of a therapist. We could just look in the mirror and identify every single thing that is kind of lurking beneath the surface. But that's not what happens. So I think our guidance accepts and acknowledges that there are those processes which deserve a chance to be explored and looked at. And as you mentioned, Joe, we don't assume that transition or medical interventions are universally helpful, right? So you talked about looking at the evidence and what we know and what we don't know about these interventions. And if we're assuming that sometimes trans identification can be adaptive and authentic, but sometimes it can be unhelpful, that also means that the corresponding medical interventions could be unhelpful as well. So we take a cautious approach to making those kinds of life-changing decisions.
I think that the most important thing about these guidelines is to give the therapists out there a choice. They're not alone with a questioning perspective, and they're not forced to adopt the affirmative care model, but there's actually a whole wealth of of information and experience that we're bringing to them. And I think that's going to be tremendously reassuring because it's a very lonely experience to buck the system.
Yeah, and it's a lonely experience to think that one should be doing one way, and it goes against all your conventional training. So I know of, because I've met so many clinicians who worked either in gender clinics or within an affirming sphere, and felt really uneasy that they weren't carrying out therapy that they felt was appropriate. And I think when they see these guidelines, they'll realize, yeah, it's okay. I can. It's all right to kind of bring a psychological approach into it. I genuinely think a lot of psychologists and psychotherapists have been suppressing their training and their instincts around this. And it's because it became politicized rather than this came from, I feel, a clinical point. I think the clinical aspect of it became politicized rather than this fabulous new theory got shoved down our throat by clinicians. It feels a political side of things shoved down our throat, the affirmative. There's a difference in that, rather than very enthusiastic psychological theorists. They weren't there. It was more a political wing. That's how I feel it kind of came about. And so we're going to have a launch of the all new beautiful guidelines. Who wants to talk about the launch? I can't wait.
Well, so first of all, when we make these guidelines public, and we're just giving them a little spit and polish right now, they will be freely available on the GETA website for all to read and find and download. And our website is genderexploratory.com. Now, they're not there yet, but hopefully within a few weeks they will be. And then we're going to launch with a webinar. What we're going to do is we've selected 2 different times to accommodate different time zones. So both will be on Saturday, December 3rd. There will be one at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, that's New York time, and another one at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And there'll be just 90 minutes, and it will be us, I think, giving an overview and probably talking through some of the case examples and making time for questions. And it's going to be free. So I hope lots of people will come, and let your colleagues know about it if you're a therapist. We'd really like to get the word out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really nice to just have some concrete, tangible, practical things that therapists can take away with them. I know for myself as a clinician, whenever I'm, doing continuing education or taking webinars, it's always so nice to have practical, applicable little nuggets that I can try out, in real time with my clients. And I think going through the case examples really helps to ground clinicians in some of that kind of practical advice. And we also know that Q&As are really valuable when somebody is feeling unsure, or they would like to ask, like, hey, what about this? I have a client going through this. What do you think? I think that can be really great. So we invite anyone to come with their questions or their ideas. If you would like to learn more about the event, you can look at the show notes for this episode. We'll have a link there, but the bit.ly link is bit.ly/GETA December. So you can find us there. And of course, on the GETA website, we'll also be updating some information about this in the next few weeks. So perhaps by the time this episode goes out, it will be up. So definitely we invite you to take a look at the GETA website for more information. What else do you guys think?
Well, I just want to say, if you're a clinician and you've been thinking about joining GETA, I just want to make sure you know that we have weekly supervision groups that are free. And there's just a wealth of really wonderful clinicians who, people in our private community can ask one another questions and look for referrals and share articles and information. So it's a really lovely community that we're building, and we welcome you if you are interested in working in this field from an exploratory standpoint.
And some people wonder about joining GETA, and they think, I'm not working in gender, can I join GETA? Or they give themselves barriers to join without understanding. No, we're kind of open to anybody joining. Not, a clinician joining who's interested in working in an exploratory way with gender. That I think that's really the criteria. It's not as people think they have to have jumped through certain hoops. And I think that's important to highlight, that there's many, many different people in GETA with all different ranges of approaches and where they're coming from.
Yeah, and additionally, you don't have to be listed in the directory. So I think this is a key question. People think, if I join GETA, I'm automatically going to be listed, and maybe due to my circumstances with my employer or whatever they may want to be for a variety of reasons. But you can join GETA and just become part of the membership community, which is behind the scenes, and you can opt out of being in the directory. And there are also people within the membership who are not listed, who aren't even necessarily clinicians. So for example, we have researchers, we have graduate students, we have psychologists in training who want to come there and just participate in the kind of community and the sharing of resources. So if you are interested and you work in the mental health field at a variety of capacities, you're welcome to come check us out.
Yeah, for example, I'm not on in the directory because I'm flat out. There's no way I can take on a new client, much as I'd love to. And so it's no biggie not to be in the directory. It's not an essential. People think it's an essential part, and it's not.
Yeah, it's optional. Although I will say, if you work in this fashion and you don't mind being listed and you're building your practice, come on in, because we've got clients for you.
Oh my God. So many people who are in so much distress, and they could really benefit. And it's not just the teenagers, it's not just ROGD. There's lots of different flavors of this, and I often think there's a lot of parents who actually would really benefit as well, just from somebody who has a good understanding. There's detransitioners, there's desisters, there's a lot of different people who've been impacted who would really benefit from this.
And thank you, Stella, for mentioning that, because I do think it's important for people to know that the GETA directory would be a great place for a detransitioner to go. I mean, most of our therapists are working with detransitioners or have a real interest in working with detransitioners. I know people have asked us many times, are you going to provide training on working with detransitioners? And I'll let you know that is in progress. It's in the works. So hopefully we'll be releasing that soon. So it's a pretty broad, open, and friendly community.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to leave it for now. How can people find us? How can people find GETA?
Our website is genderexploratory.com.
And the Eventbrite link for the launch of the clinical guidance will be in the show notes of this episode. So if you are a therapist listening, we would love to see you there, and we invite everybody to join. And we really enjoyed this episode and just being able to share a little bit more about the organization and the guidance with you guys. Thanks, Lisa and Joe.
Thanks for having us on.
It was good.
It was great.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens. This podcast is sponsored by Rhyme and GenSpect, and listener support means a lot to us. The best way to help is to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Follow us on social media, and if you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts of the show, special Q&As, and you can join our listener community. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.